Here.
Ladies and gentlemen, we tell you, coming from Affirmative side, that the creation of these exclusive schools for students who seem LGBTQIF, meaning lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, questioning / queer individual fluidity, is important to both the protection of the minority in this debate, the students who are identified as LGBT, and the empowerment of lesbians and gays at the end of the day. So now before I go on, let me define to you some keywords in motion. Now, we tell you, coming from government side, that these students who are identified as LGBT are considered out of the closet. Now, if we take a look at it, these people can change their gender on their forms if they want to. For example, if I'm gay, which is not really true. For example, if I'm gay and I'm part of the LGBT movement, I can put on my form that I'm female rather than male. So now going on to our policy, we tell you coming from government side that we're not going to force these students to enroll in the school. We're just going to give them more avenues, because we tell you coming from Affirmative side is that with more choices, with more avenues, there are better chances of reaching your goal. Please sit down. Yeah, later. Now, also, we tell you that the choices must be made by the decision, not the parents, not the guardians, but the children. Why? Because they're actually the ones who are going to be enrolled in school, and they're the ones who are going to learn at the end of the day. Now, also, we tell you, coming from government side, is that we're not going to abolish co-education schools. Like they're males and females are in the same school together. Now, we're not going to abolish that. And we're also not going to abolish these anti-bullying programs, because we tell you that we understand that bullying won't stop even in whatever we're going to do. But we're going to tell you on government side how empowerment for these LGBT students will be better achieved. Now, we tell you that our case in this debate is that we need to protect the rights of the minority, in this case the LGBT students, and we also need to make sure that they can build up confidence and they can be empowered at the end of the day. Now, coming from government side, we're going to set this debate in liberal democracies. Not any other country, not any other kind of political ideology. Now, please, later. Now, going on to my arguments. Firstly, I'm going to argue how the creation of these exclusive schools for these kinds of students have positive effects similar to those of the single-sex schools. Now, if we take a look at the effects of single-sex schools, and I quote, "Positive outcomes from single-sex education for both boys and girls, including higher reading and foreign language achievement, less sex stereotype course taking patterns, more time spent at homework, higher educational aspirations, and decreased sex role stereotyping." Meaning, they're more focused on their studies, they're more focused on their homeworks, and they're not distracted by any kind of attraction to the separate sex, and they want to achieve a lot in life through education. But yet, the positive effects of single-sex schools, like girls' colleges and men's only universities, have the same positive effects in the exclusive schools for students who are identified as LGBT. But we tell you, coming from government side, is that there are more benefits at the end of the day. If we take a look at gays, and lesbians or bisexuals and etc. in schools where two genders are in the same place, we tell you that they are being discriminated in these schools, and we tell you that the best course of action is to create exclusive schools for these kind of students. And sure.
So why are you trying to perpetuate and feed to the narrative that these LGBT people are necessarily different from the heterosexual community?
Ladies and gentlemen, if you take a look at society, we tell you that these gays aren't really accepted yet, and I'm going to expand more on that on my second argument. But sure, let me just finish my first argument. Okay. Now we tell you that the best course of action is these exclusive schools for students who are LGBT, because they will fit in more in those schools. Since they're interacting with their own gender, since they're interacting with their own kind, we tell you that they will build up confidence, and they will build up confidence at the end of the day. Now we also tell you that the teachers in these schools can't be sexist because they'll lose their jobs, and plus if we're going to make these exclusive schools, we tell you that the teachers must be of the same gender as they are. Now, going on to my second argument, this will be a quick one. Now, we tell you that the creation of these schools is a kind of affirmative action for the minority. Now, we tell you, coming from government side, that the legislation of the state is the best. The legislation of the state is the best way to mold the lifestyles of people. For example, if during the past we saw a lot of people were okay with killing people, okay with murdering people. But when the state made the laws that prohibited murder, look at society now. We tell you that their mindsets have changed. This is the same in this debate. Once the state supports the creation of these exclusive schools, we tell you that the state is actually accepting accepting gays and lesbians into society, in which they don't deny them anymore. Plus, it will also build confidence in these students. We tell you that they are going to interact with their own kind, and they will build up confidence because they know that there are other people like them. Now we tell you that they can still interact with society, so you can't say that they're just going to be more marginalized. They can still interact with society outside the school. Just because you're gay doesn't mean you can't have straight friends at the end of the day. So just to sum up this speech, we're not going to force them to enroll in these schools. That there are more positive effects in these exclusive schools for these students, and we're giving them affirmative action at the end of the day. And because of all these reasons, if you really want gays and lesbians to be empowered and be protected at the end of the day, go with our side. Thank you.
Here.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Right, thank you very much. We now invite the first speaker of the opposition team from Nanyang.
Opposition thinks that the exclusivity that's actually promoted by the creation of these exclusive schools actually regresses the gay rights movement, and also that defeats the purpose of education, which is what we'll be elaborating on for today. So before I move on to my substantive, a bit on policy. So what we're going to do is that we're going to have them in the same kind of schools. We're not going to have any we're not going to separate them, and if there's any bullying in that school, then we will just be providing them with the appropriate support to ensure that they can do well in those schools. But we think that firstly there won't be any bullying in the first place, so these kinds of policies won't be really implemented. Why so? Because this kind of discrimination against homosexuals has begun to be frowned upon within society by itself. Because society has already moved on from the perception that homosexuals are necessarily bad, and the government reflects this through their policies. Like for example, in the US, in which like the gay rights movement has been furthered by the government actually allowing the homosexuals to marry each other. And we think that this is a demonstration of the kind of movement that the kind of progress that the gay rights movement has achieved. Which is why we think that not as much support would be needed. Because if I see that society does not approve of my beliefs and approve of my discrimination of other people, I think that discrimination will really occur in that case. So some rebuttals before I move on to my substantives. So firstly, on the effectiveness of their policy, right? So they said that they're not going to be forcing people to enroll, but rather to be providing more avenues for these kinds of LGBTQ individuals to actually take, right? But we think that what will happen is that the majority of LGBTQ individuals will go to these kinds of schools, and when they go, because they see that they see the immediate effects of them going to the school, in which they get an immediate community and they feel the kind of happiness that comes about that community. But because these kids are the ones that are choosing it, and they don't get to see the long-term effects of having a separation of these two communities. Because what happens is that when we separate the LGBTQ community and we separate the majority of heterosexuals, what's going to happen is that the majority is going to see that minority. Thank you. That majority is going to see that minority as some separate being, and other, which makes it much easier for the majority to discriminate against the minority in this case. And because the kids don't really see the effects of their decisions, right? All the harms of them choosing it will still occur in their policy. So on my second substantive, my second rebuttal on their substantive about the positive effects of their policy. So when they first came up, they went to draw parallels to single-sex schools. But the thing is that they have never established, they have never established the similarity between like separating genders and separating people who identify with different sexual orientations. And we think that they need to prove that before all their benefits can take place. But secondly, we think that what happened is that education is beneficially affected in single-sex schools because there's a perception that actually males learn differently from females. But in this case, we think that the LGBTQ individuals don't actually learn differently from heterosexuals. There's never been any scientific study that's ever proved that. And we think that there's no benefit, there's no genuine basis for any separation for the benefits of education. And even if this does occur, I'll be elaborating on the harms of this in my substantive. Secondly, they came up to tell us a second substantive about legislation and discrimination, which is 1 minute after their time ended, which we think is quite unfair, but I'm going to deal with it anyway. We think that it's not true that discrimination has not been entirely eradicated. We think that there's been substantial movements trying to fix discrimination in schools, and I'll be elaborating on that in my substantive. So moving on to my substantive for today. Today I'll be talking about how we further the LGBTQ movement, and my second speaker will be talking about the purpose of how we further the purpose of education. But before I move on, yes ma'am.
Okay. How would you guarantee that discrimination will be lessened even if you make an appropriate action in these co-ed schools?
Well, we think that the discrimination will be lessened precisely as I'll elaborate in my substantive about how these heterosexual majority will be able to interact with the homosexual minority, the LGBTQ minority, and you'll be able to see how they are so similar to this homosexual minority, and from there acceptance will occur. So moving on to my substantive. We think that society has moved on and there's an increase in acceptance within society for these minority of individuals, right? So why has this acceptance occurred? Because recently there have been a lot of campaigning for integration by the gay rights movement, by the LGBTQ movement. For example, this gay rights movement also actually has a lot of campaigns in which they, like for example in Disneyland, for 1 day in every year, the LGBTQ movement actually goes to Disneyland with their families of the same sex, and they show how they're so similar to the heterosexual majority in Disneyland, showing how ultimately they still share the same human emotions and feelings of love and within their family. And we think that this kinds of demonstrations of how homosexuals are so similar to heterosexuals are key to the campaign for integration. And this shows how homosexuals are not exclusive at all from heterosexuals, other than the fact of their sexuality, which the homosexuals then show to be insignificant as compared to the ultimate greater emotions of love that are present within all humans, right? So why is exclusivity necessary necessarily bad in this case, because what we're going to do is that we're going to ensure that the LGBTQ movement and the LGBTQ individuals and the heterosexuals are able to interact, which means that stereotypes that are easily perpetuated will be harder to dispel because they have no basis to compare easily with, right? If I get a very easy to understand stereotype about an individual, if I do not make the effort to interact with the individual, I will never see the differences between the stereotype and the actual individual. And what we think will happen, so how do we solve it, right? We actually put them together so that there's no more exclusivity. And we think that this is beneficial because we're going to be doing it in the kids' formative years, in which their views and their political views are actually decided at that point of time because they spend so much time in school and hence their views are heavily influenced by their peers in school. And when they are actually homosexuals in their school, that means that it's highly likely for their friend circle to be consisting of those homosexuals, right? And we think that when they actually go out to society, this friend circle will likely follow them into society, hence influencing their view not just from the time that they are in school, but also the time when they go out to society. This means that the society from now onwards will be more and more accepting of these LGBTQ individuals precisely because they've had so much time to interact with these individuals when they were at school. So because we actually further the LGBTQ movement, please go with side opposition.
We thank the speaker for her speech. We now invite the second speaker from the government team, the Deputy Prime Minister.
Hey. We think in this society that as you have males, you have females, you also have in between the LGBTQ. We believe that as you have already established gender exclusive schools for males and gender exclusive schools for females, we think that the sector of these genders that hasn't been provided for yet in other countries is the LGBT. Right now, we have this Harvey Milk High School. This is the first taxpayer-funded all LGBT school right now. You see that when the school was established, you see that these LGBT students who were part of the LGBT can tend to interact more. We see that as they interact with each other, they can more encourage each other, and you will see that integrated in my arguments later on. But first, let's respond. We're going to respond to their side because they asked us to parallelize on how having single-sex schools to having an LGBTQ school. We think that as a female, as a single-sex school has the same gender, has students of the same gender. We think that the LGBT has their own gender and they have their own set of beliefs according to their gender as well. We think that this is enough reason to we think that it's going to be as effective as these gender-based schools, these single-sex schools. As my partner already told you a while ago, he already told you that as these female, these gender-exclusive schools have already provided positive results. We think that that's also going to happen on our side. And even if there is no scientific study that heterosexual schools are going to be more of a benefit, more of a harm than a benefit to these students from the LGBT. We can see in society that as you enter a school, there's always this gay who's going to be mocked for being gay. There's always this lesbian who's going to be discriminated for believing that she feels empowered when she's doing acts of a man, right? We think that when you have gender-based schools, this is going to be an avenue to show your real self, and we believe that there's still going to be interaction between these these students from the LGBT movement and other students who aren't part of the LGBT. No, thank you. Later. We think that as we provide an avenue, it's going to be an avenue for you to have more choices. We think that when you have more choices, the individual can self-actualize more. And how does this happen on our side? As my RPM already told you, teachers are going to be screened, so therefore they're less likely to be sexist. We also told you that these students are most likely going to have the same beliefs. Therefore, when there are less ways for them to be bullied, they can self-actualize more. And they will excel in their studies because they are more confident in life. Because we believe that when you are self-actualizing, you can be a more productive citizen of the state at the end of the day. We believe that that principle applies here because if you are boosted with confidence, if you are given protection by the state, if you can be safe and believe in what you believe in, we think that that's important at the end of the day. And as we know that the LGBT is still a marginalized sector of society, we think that by creating these LGBT-based schools, we can hit two birds with one stone. Because as that happens, as the screening happens, more likely that we're going to be hiring LGBT teachers. But we're not saying that we're just limited to that. But it's more likely that we're going to be hiring LGBT teachers who are part of the LGBTQ movement. Therefore, we can let them have jobs, and also students can also have a higher chance of learning. Because we believe that as we screen, these students are less discriminated in the classroom, right? Because as we learn about reproductive health and all that, it's obvious that once a teacher cracks a joke about the gay, about the lesbian, therefore that student who is affected will be less confident, and it will provide more of an avenue for that student to be bullied. We think that when you have less gender discrimination, you can have less gender discrimination on our side, because when these people have the same feelings, they can encourage each other and they have confidence. Because when you band a group together, you can fight for what you believe for. That's why we have the feminist movement. That's why we have all these kinds of movements, because we believe that when they become together, they become stronger because they know that they're not alone, and that's what we want to happen on our side. So if I basically talk to you about how having a LGBT school is also going to reap the same benefits as a gender exclusive based school, by telling you that LGBT being part of LGBT is also gender. And I also told you that when you have more choices, you can self-actualize more. And that's why our side is going to win this debate. Thank you.
Here.
Excellent. Thank you very much for that speech. We now invite the second speaker of the opposition team, the deputy leader.
So we understand
understand the noble intentions coming from side propositions. Side proposition wants to empower youth, but we don't think that we want to empower the LGBTQ, but we don't think they're successfully doing that because they're still promoting this idea of separate but equal. We try to further their rights, but inherently they're different, so they must exist in a different education system. So we don't think this will effectively promote LGBTQ, increase their confidence, or better the perception and destroy the stereotypes, which side proposition has been talking about so much. But before I move on to my rebuttals and my substantive, I'd just like to point out a clarification. I think this is a small source of confusion is to it. Side proposition has been talking about gender binaries and people who are actually maybe they are born in a female sex, but they have a mindset of a male. But we don't really think that this is actually part of the debate. This debate is talking more about the different sexualities of people, which is LGBTQ. So I think maybe this is why it was confusing, because that's why they talked about single-sex schools and they drew this parallel, but we don't really think that the analysis stands. But okay, so now let me move on. I have two main points of contention. Firstly, how best to empower the LGBTQ people in terms of confidence in terms of self-perception, and secondly, how to deal with the perception of other people, and how to break down the stereotypes that we have, like heterosexuals have, of the LGBTQ movement. So let me deal with my first point of contention, right? So the main point coming from their second proposition speaker is that if they exist in a different kind of school, in an exclusive LGBT school, there will be less discrimination. This means they will increase their self-confidence. But we don't think this will happen because we think that the LGBTQ, because they are existing in a separate school, they don't really interact a lot with the heterosexual people, or in fact, the normal people of society, because we see that in this debate, only specifically the LGBTQ are excluded from the rest of society, and they're not even excluded because of race or religion. So, because there's this separate mindset, the LGBTQ existing in these exclusive schools will always have this underlying sense of doubt, like, why am I in a separate school? What are the normal schools doing? Will I ever be am I learning the same syllabus as them? Will I ever be equal? So it's actually, we think that this lack of confidence in us happening in this case is so much worse it's so much worse when it happens with side propositions because it's an underlying sense of self-doubt in terms of in terms of your self-confidence and your position of society, not just so we don't and even if side proposition successfully creates a momentary feeling of happiness and self-confidence, we don't really think that actually makes a lot of difference anyway. So now let me talk more about the long term. So side proposition said also, okay, I'll elaborate more on the confidence point in this case. So side proposition also talked about how if they exist in a separate part of society, they'll be able to study better, they'll be able to focus better in their studies. But we think that actually side proposition has never really brought us any kind of analysis on how these LGBTQ people would live in society when we get out of school, right? Because even though we are very, very happy that we are existing in a changing society with growing acceptance of LGBTQ, the truth is there will never be 100% acceptance of LGBTQ. There will always be a few people in society, which is something that I elaborate more on my substantive, that will never truly accept these LGBTQ people. So this means that because they exist in an exclusive school, a vacuum of acceptance, these LGBTQ people, when they go out into society and when they are faced with discrimination, they'll never truly be able to cope with that, and their self-confidence will be extremely affected. At least in our case, when they exist in an inclusive school with all the kinds of people inside, they will have support structures to help them to learn how to cope with these feelings of discrimination, maybe counseling, maybe with fellow LGBTQ. So now on to the second part of contention on the idea of perception. So I have two main rebuttals under this point. Firstly, side proposition, the first speaker developed this analysis of perception on how actually they didn't really explain to us a lot on why this perception would be improved. But anyway, I'll explain to you how we better do it outside. Firstly, and exactly what side proposition said. In their second speaker, they said that the LGBTQ people tend to have a similar set of beliefs. And why do these LGBTQ people have similar set of beliefs? Because there are certain beliefs that help. The liberal, we think that the liberal part of society tend to have similar points of view. This means that if these LGBTQ people who tend to be liberals exist in this inclusive LGBTQ society, they'll never truly be exposed to different points of view. So this difference in opinion and societal and mindsets and opinions in society will further widen inside proposition's case. So now the second lab analysis on this separate but equal thing. We think that when the LGBTQ exists in a different part of exists in a separate school, there will be this feeling of victimization because obviously as side proposition and we clarified and we characterized, the LGBTQ are a minority and they are facing some amount of discrimination in society. So then they'll be like, oh, fellow LGBTQ people, oh, these heterosexual people are so wrong because they don't understand us, and especially because we don't interact with them and they exist in different kinds of schools. This feeling of resentment of being like a minority or being a victim to society will be further like increased now in this case. And then also the point on this first proposition's point on the government's part, we think that especially the fact that the government says that we will put LGBTQ in a separate school, like apart from heterosexuals, shows that the government thinks that the LGBTQ are inherently different from heterosexuals, which we think is a really, really bad societal mindset to perpetuate. But now moving on to my substantive on the purpose of education. So we see, education is not mainly about educating a person in terms of academically. They want to be able to best train these people to exist well in society. And this means that that's why we have certain social codes that people have to follow. We can't walk out of class when we feel like we don't really want to study because it's socially wrong and then we'll be punished from society. So the implication of this, and why does the government care about teaching us to follow certain social codes? Because this is extremely important in like the stability of society. In the stability of society and like the functioning of society. Because if everyone does whatever they want without any sense of what's acceptable and what's not acceptable, like society will be very haywire, will be very hard to function. So let me deal with the two groups of people in this group. Okay, so Nicole talked about the majority of people who eventually go and accept LGBT, but I talked about the very religious or maybe the very conservative people. And we think that these people, it's very hard to actually change their mindsets towards LGBTQ. So inherently, they will always feel, they will always have this strong feeling against LGBTQ. But we think that at least in these schools where there are LGBTQ and heterosexual people, the school will be able to regulate their behavior. At least they are not doing extremely offensive things towards these people and inciting a lot of negative feelings towards both groups. So this helps the social functioning. And as I explained earlier in my rebuttals, this will also help LGBTQ because they always face some amount of discrimination. So we are just helping the LGBTQ to eventually function well in society because they know how to deal with the discrimination. So if you truly believe in like empowering LGBTQ and integrating all of us, please go with side opposition. Thank you.
Right, thanks speaker for a speech. We now invite the third substantive speaker from the government team. Government.
We see in status quo that there are two genders, the females and the males. But then, we see that society evolves and bam, there's the LGBTQIA. But then, we see not everyone is accepting them fully. Yes, they may be accepted in some sectors of society, but they're still marginalized. And we don't want that in our side. Because at least in our side, we already proved to you how would we lessen this discrimination. We already told you how would we empower these students who are under the LGBTQIA. Because side opposition didn't even prove to us how would they guarantee to lessen discrimination at the end of the day. Because in their side, they kept on blabbing out that they'll only empower these LGBTs by doing what's right when you get bullied. But then in their side, it's a slow progress. Because first, they're going to take action of bullying cases about these LGBTs. But then, we see not everyone files these cases because some are afraid to file these cases. While others, even if you reprimand them not to bully someone, they'll still do it. Going to my first issue. Going to my first issue is about marginalization. We see that inside the position, yes, we do consider the fact we can remove discrimination at the end of the day, but at least in our side we're lessening it.
Because on their side, they kept on saying that these people have moved on because society accepts them already. But we think not. Because we still see gays doing rallies for these gays having anxiety and depression at the end of the day because they're being judged. And we don't like that because we see students are kids. Teenagers are very vulnerable. We see them as someone who's incapable of defending themselves. And this is why we want to put them in an exclusive school in which they could express themselves freely with people who are actually like them. We see sit down. We see in the opposition side, they kept on saying, they told us that they can be open to society. But then, it's a school. We see in a school that there are filters, so they can still coexist with society. They could still interact with straight people. The Prime Minister already told you a while ago that there are a lot of avenues. They could also have friends who are straight. But if we're not yes.
Don't you think that the interaction will be a lot lesser on your side when they exist in separate schools? So we still wait for them to do it.
Look, in your side there would be there would be interactions, but that interaction is poisonous. Because we see that once this LGBTQIA student interacts with a straight student, then there's more likely for him to be judged. Because we see bigotry in society, which is already told you a while ago by the Deputy Prime Minister. Because she already told you that these children are getting hated for being what they are, for believing on what they believe in. And this is why we want to put them in a scope in which they could interact with people who has the same beliefs as them. Because even if opposition side will tell that they want discourse, that's why they want this to happen. But this discourse is poisonous because we see that even if they co-interact with each other, it's more likely for them to feel something within themselves which isn't right. And we don't like that in our side. Because in our side, we value self-actualization. What is self-actualization? It's the feeling of total happiness. The Deputy Prime Minister already elaborated, but I will tell you how this really happened. Because we see, once you put them in an exclusive school that they choose to go in, which already told you by the Prime Minister, if we let them choose to go to these exclusive schools in which they feel belong, they'll feel loved, they'll feel accepted in society. The thing that opposition said, which is false, is that they'll question. First, they wouldn't question because we already told you we're not forcing the child. We want him to decide for themselves because the government is a loving government and it's a government's duty to protect the minority, which is already told you a while ago by the Prime Minister. Another thing, the opposition side questioned about these LGBTQIS they're similar with the heterosexuals about education. Yes, we see that, but how would they actually do good within schools when they're bullied, when they're not accepted by the collective? Because in our side, we do believe that these LGBTQIF students should be empowered at the end of the day. Going to my second issue is about the interaction. As I said a while ago, these LGBTQIF students will still interact with these straight people, with these heterosexuals, because we're not stopping them from interacting. We're just giving them the avenue to be someone in which they want to be, because we believe that these LGBTQIF students, they can be anything they want as long as it doesn't harm society. And this is why we're going to give them affirmative action. This is why we want to empower them. This is why we want to give them choices. We want to give them avenues. Because we believe, even if they're saying that they're still going to be confident at the end of the day, there will be more confidence in their side. Because there's there's less likely of a chance of them being judged at the end of the day because they're all the same. They're all LGBTQIS. So there's less likely for people to judge who they are. In conclusion to these issues and the arguments made by my partners, we do concede that we can't remove discrimination at the end of the day, but then we could lessen it because we are the voices of these LGBT students, because we believe that change is a law of life. Thank you.
Thank you very much. For the final substantive speech of the debate, now I invite the opposition whip.
Let us look at who the LGBT community actually is. The LGBT community is a community of people who have different sexual or gender orientations from the rest of society. And the rest of the society, which is the heterosexual community, is deemed more normal than the LGBT community. The problem in society then is that the LGBT community are being excluded and isolated in society. But we see that within today's society, we're having increasing acceptance of the LGBT community. We see that discrimination, various forms of discrimination such as racism, sexism, or even the discrimination against the LGBT community is currently being frowned upon. And we see that right now, society is moving on and starting to embrace the LGBT community even more right now. But we see the problem then, proposition's case, is that they're going to regress all forms of progress they were made so far by putting these students in as exclusive and separate schools. We see that they're perpetuating and feeding into the narrative that this LGBT community is necessarily different from the rest of society. And we see this is what is so problematic with their case today. So I'm going to prove to you 2 questions for today's debate. But before I go on to prove that, just one point, just one housekeeping issue to settle. They didn't rebut my second speaker's point on how we are going to better fulfill and further the purpose of education, because right now we want to tell the students that there is a that society consists of different people and we need to teach them to accept different people and be acceptive and be able to engage and interact with different people. But necessarily separating and allowing these 2 groups of students to be separated, we think this goes against the purpose of education. We think this is a point that haven't rebutted on their side, and we think this point falls to us. So then moving on to the 2 points of today's debate. Firstly, who best reduces discrimination against the LGBTQ community? And secondly, which side better achieves self-actualization for these LGBTQ students? So then moving on to the first point of who best removes discrimination against this student, right? Now the core logic of proposition side can be summarized as follows. They think that because the LGBTQ isn't being accepted, they're going to be discriminated and bullied in schools, and that this is bad for the students. Firstly, we've already told you from the very first speaker, there's a really increasing acceptance in school, and we think that this is a very unlikely situation and scenario to happen. But more than our policy, we've also already told you that we're going to provide as much support as we can in this unlikely scenario. And because of this, we think, no thank you sir, we think that we are already helping these students as much as possible. But more than that, we're going to go on a comparative basis here on who best reduce discrimination in the long run, right? Now we see that these students are eventually going to grow up and are going to have to go to society. They can't be shielded in an exclusive and separate school throughout their whole lives. They are going to have to learn how to exist and survive in a society where people being discriminated against them. Now the problem then, we think there are 2 problems then. The first problem side proposition is going to bring is that they're going to perpetuate and feed into the narrative that this LGBT community is necessarily so different that they have to be cut away from the rest of society. I think the problem then, no thank you, dames and sirs, the problem then is that when they go into society, the rest of the heterosexual community is then going to think that it's legitimate to discriminate against the LGBT community because because they've all along been isolated and separated and they've been seen as two different entities. No, thank you, ma'am and sir. And we think the problem then is that this discrimination is never going to be solved. What proposition may be doing is that they're going to reduce the manifestations and the instances of discrimination in the younger years, in the younger days of the students' lives, but they're never going to eradicate discrimination as a whole, because they're forever, these two communities are forever going to be seen as separate and different from each other. We think that side propositions feeding to this narrative, and yet this is a narrative we necessarily want to kill, want to eradicate and remove from society. Yeah, but more than that, we think that's extremely harmful for the LGBTQ community to be grouped together and isolated from the rest of society. Because like what my first speaker said, most of your friends you gain are from your formative years. And as you grow up, these are the friends you maintain certain connections and relationships to. But when you grow up and you only have make friends with people of the same sexuality or of this particular community, the problem then is that you're going to be stuck in this isolated community even when you grow up. And again, this is going to impede integration into the rest of society. And again, it's extremely problematic on side proposition part. But then moving on to the second point of today's debate, on who which side better achieves self-actualization, right? Now what side proposition told us was that in a separate school, the LGBTQ community can freely express their identity, and this can bring them more fulfillment and happiness. Now firstly, we really rebutted the characterization of the lack of acceptance. So I think this already rebuts the point. But more than that, we don't think even if you are in a school with heterosexual people and homosexual people, we think it's still possible to form a certain community there and be able to freely express your identity with this group of people. The only difference between side proposition and opposition in this case is that we're not isolating this community and making this community the only in relation to the connections that you have throughout all your years. You're not giving them an exclusive, you're not giving them this exclusive sense of community from the very younger years. Yes, then also.
You have to understand that the act of the state to support the creation of these schools means that they do acknowledge that there's a problem in these communities and they want to try to solve it.
So, the fact that the government is going to come up here with all legitimacy and put them in a different school is telling the public that it's perfectly alright to see the LGBTQ community as different, as separate, as a community that can be looked down upon or discriminated against. The government is going to come up here and make it perfectly alright for this community to be isolated and excluded from the rest of society. We don't see how your side is in any way helping the problem. We think you're perpetuating the problem and making this problem even worse. But moving back to my point, we think that you're still going to be able to provide a sense of community in the school or even outside the school for these people to be able to self-actualize and freely express their identity. But we don't want it to be so that this community is going to be their only one community. Their only community, like side proposition right now, is so going to make it happen. So because of all I've said, because firstly we're going to reduce discrimination in the long run. Secondly, because we're also able to help the LGBTQ community express their identity, but make sure they're not isolated from the rest of society. Please go to side opposition.
Right, thank you very much. We now move on to replies. First reply from opposition. Here.
You think that the problem of this debate is this side proposition actually never really dealt with our substantives. We brought too many different kinds of analysis of how their self-confidence in the long term on the societal functioning. But the only viewpoint that we see coming from side proposition is the idea of a momentary self-confidence, which should never really prove to us the significance of this momentary self-confidence that they exist in their school, they feel happy, but how will this actually affect them in the long term? So that's why I have three main points for today. Firstly, on empowering LGBTQ, secondly, on perception, and thirdly, on social functioning. Now, before I move on to my first point on empowering LGBTQ, I'd like to point out that actually our side brought out many different forms of organization. We said that the LGBTQ movement is improving, so there's a growing sense of acceptance. But the only paradigm that such proposition dealt with is a paradigm of people always discriminated against LGBTQ, which really isn't the case. So now, let me deal with the first point. Let me talk about this in the short term. As I explained earlier, such proposition brought to rise the idea that that the LGBTQ, when they exist in their exclusive schools, they feel self-confident because there's not really a lot of discrimination or judgment that's going on there. But our comments to this is that firstly, they never really prove to us what's the significance of this. So what if they feel happy and they comfortable in their own skin in that 6 years of school? When they go out, when they exist in the real world, when they face discrimination, they will never ever feel comfortable in themselves. And this was something I brought to them in our second speaker speech, but they never really dealt with it. So, and I explained to you, and I think my third speaker further this point, that it's really bad that when they exist in a vacuum, that they don't go out to reality, they don't deal with the real situation, because they won't really know how to react when they go out into the real world. And thirdly, we explained to you how we have actually structures in our school that ensures that there is not an incredible amount of discrimination that's happening against LGBTQ. We told you that about school regulations, that obviously the schools will not condone discrimination against LGBTQ. My first speaker actually brought to the idea of social pressure, that how, especially because the LGBTQ and the heterosexuals exist together, and obviously there are a lot of liberal heterosexuals who actually support LGBTQ. Because of this social pressure, there wouldn't be so much discrimination that's happening so badly as side proposition characterized. So let me deal with and lastly, I talked to you about the long term and how on our side we actually improve the self-confidence. And how on their side the unconfidence that's happening on their side is not worse, because they exist in a separate school. They will always be wondering what the heterosexual school will be doing. There's always this underlying sense of unconfidence because they're not really sure how they stand in society or why they are being separated. So now on the second point of perception. I brought you a lot of analysis, and my third speaker brought you a lot of analysis on this, which was never actually very well dealt with in that proposition. We explained to you the mindset. If they exist in a structurally physical separate school from heterosexuals, this means that this will perpetuate the mindset that the government actually thinks that they're different, and that's why they have to exist in separate schools, because we shouldn't be interacting with normal people. And secondly, this will actually increase the divide because of this lacking interaction. Because of this lacking interaction, there will be less chance for these stereotypes to break down. So side opposition said that there will be a little interaction happening in their case, but as my third speaker brought to you, this little action comparatively is a lot less compared to outside where the interaction happens all the time. And in my second speaker speech, I also brought to you the idea of us against the world. The fact that they exist in a separate school, they will think that, I'm being victimized, and that's why I have to be put in a separate school, and that's why I'm so different from heterosexuals, I'll never be fair to them. So, last point on social functioning, which was actually never dealt with on our side. I brought to you this in my substantive on how in our schools, because schools are meant to be a microcosm society. So this means that there will, in schools there will always be a certain people who will never truly accept them. So at least they'll know how to deal with these emotions and they won't affect the social structure of the school. I also explained to you how the LGBTQ will better be able to deal with discrimination when they go out to the real world. So if you believe all I said, if you truly believe, truly want to empower LGBTQ, please go outside opposition. Thank you.
Thank you very much. For the final speech of this debate, we now invite government's reply.
Ladies and gentlemen, the opposition side must stop saying that the affirmative side didn't prove what we were supposed to prove, even if they didn't even prove what they were supposed to prove in this debate. Now, the flaws in all of their speeches, I don't even know where to start. Let me just start with they never listened to our policy. Now, our policy clearly states, coming from me a while ago, that we're still going to allow them to interact with the outside world. We didn't tell you that we're just going to trap them inside school, because take a look at our education. Are we trapped inside the school? No, we can still go outside. We can still go outside the school borders. We can still interact with society. We can still interact with social. We can still interact with other sectors of society. So their idea that we're going to trap them inside these schools forever, it was already preempted. Now they also gave us the idea about questioning the child. Come on. We already told you that it's the decision of the children because they're the ones who are getting enrolled and they're the ones who are supposed to learn in the first place. So that idea is already preempted. So just to conclude the response, all their ideas are already preempted coming from our first speaker, which is me, Mark. Now, just to tell you, they never responded to our idea about that legislation in the state is the best way to mold the mindsets of people. Now we tell you that the state, yes, is the molder of mindsets. Like the example I gave you a while ago in my PM speech. Now, we tell you that the act of supporting the creation of these schools says that the state is accepting that there's a problem with the gay community, and that problem is discrimination, and the fact that they want to solve it through supporting the creation of these schools, make sure that they care about the gay communities. So the act of supporting these schools, the act of supporting these schools says that the state cares about the LGBT movement and not the other way around. Now we tell you about the standards of self-actualization. We tell you that there are three. You need to have self-esteem, you need to feel accepted by society, and you have to be secure with yourself. Now we tell you on our side, in our policy, that by interacting with your own gender, we tell you that you will have confidence in yourself because no one in your school is opposing your gender. So now going on to that standard of acceptance, since you believe that there's no opposition against you, you don't care about the judgments of people, you don't care about the stereotypes that are held against you. Now, to that last standard about safety, since you don't believe that there are any kind of bad stereotypes against you, you believe that you're secure with who you are. You're secured about even if I'm out of the closet, I'm secured of my own gender. So but if you take a look at their side, they never fulfilled any of these requirements for self-actualization. So now let's say that these flaws never happened on their side. We tell you that they never had an effective policy. Now, if we recall their first speakers, if we take a look at their first speaker's speech, she told us that we're going to support these discriminated LGBT students. We tell you that we do appreciate that there's a noble cause to that policy. We do appreciate that coming from our side. But we tell you that they're not taking any action against those who are discriminating against them. Which means that even if you try to support the discriminated, it isn't really effective because you're not tackling the problem at its roots. Now, but if we coming from our side, that if the state supports the creation of these exclusive schools, we tell you that discrimination against your gender is impossible because everyone there is of the same sex, and nobody hates you for being gay. So if you believe, Mr. Chair, that if you believe in what's right, and if you want the gay community to be truly accepted into society, go with our side. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Begin, I invite you to cross the floor and shake hands.